Hello and welcome to the Microbiome Medics podcast. I'm Dr. Siobhan McCormack.
And I'm Dr. Sheena Fraser, and we're your co-hosts.
We are both GPs and lifestyle medics with a shared passion for microbiome science, and we have spent the last 5 years deep diving into the world of the gut microbiome.
We've been analysing the evidence, appraising the studies, speaking to the experts, and writing the Gut Microbiome for Clinicians e-learning course for the BSLM Learning Academy.
We have discovered that the gut and other human microbiomes are pivotal to every aspect of your health and physiology, and the pillars of lifestyle medicine hold the key.
So in these Microbiome Medic podcasts, we'll be covering the basics, bringing you the latest research and talking to the experts on all matters microbiome.
We'll be translating the evidence and packaging it into actionable, bite-sized chunks so that you can harness the power of the microbiome to improve your own health and that of your patients. Hello and welcome to another episode of Microbiome Medics podcast. I'm Dr. Siobhan McCormack and I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Sheena Fraser. If you've been following the podcast, you'll be aware that you are host to trillions of microbial lodgers. They live in communities in various parts of your body, on your skin, vagina, mouth. Most of these microbes are bacteria and most reside in your gut. So that's why the gut microbiome is the most researched human microbiome to date. Now, these microbes are not passive passengers, they're really important active participants, and they have a huge impact on every aspect of your development, physiology and health in childhood and beyond, and then be called a so-called organ. Now, today we're going to be talking about the composition of your gut microbiome. That's the variety of different species and their abundance, because this is key to the function. So who is there is key to what they do. Remarkably, the makeup of our gut microbiomes is unique to each of us. It's rather like a fingerprint. So things you should be asking are, where do my microbes come from? And how come there's such an individual variation in its makeup? You want to ensure how you get the best team together. And what about if you've got a lousy team of microbes in your gut? Are you doomed? Well, we will be answering all your questions in this episode when we cover the genesis of your gut microbiome. We're going to be focusing on the mode of delivery. And I'm joined today by Sheena, hopefully, who's speaking to us from Fife. Sheena, are you there?
Hi, Siobhan. Yes, I'm here. I'm not in Glasgow today. I am in Fife on a family holiday. And it's lovely. Sun's out. We've had a lovely coastal walk this morning and a dip in the sea.
So you've been cold water swimming?
I have. I went this morning and yesterday morning. So I am slowly adapting to it. It's lovely. And actually, I'm just trying to enhance my skin microbiome with a few organisms from the sea here, hoping that this is an unpolluted sea. So yes, it's lovely. So Siobhan, I was going to start off by talking about how we actually get our microbes at the very, very start of life. So what we're going to do is sort of introduce you to where these come from. So starting off with the mode of delivery, we're going to compare vaginal delivery versus C-section delivery versus, the mother's microbiome and how that influences things. So you actually do need to sort of start off thinking about, if you're thinking about where your infant gets their microbiome from, the mother's microbiome is key to that. So essentially, during the pregnancy, the mother's microbiome changes, and hopefully you've got a mum that's got a fairly decent microbiome, but obviously that is determined by the mother's lifestyle. So whether they have a healthy diet, whether they exercise, get enough sleep, are not on lots of medications and things that will disrupt their microbiome. And then during the pregnancy itself, the microbiome in the gut changes and it becomes less diverse and it becomes slightly more pro-inflammatory. And actually, whilst you're pregnant, you develop a sort of mild version of metabolic syndrome. Depending on your diet, that could be more extreme, with some women gaining quite a lot of weight and putting their sugar levels up and actually even developing diabetes in pregnancy. But for most individuals who are pregnant, you kind of develop a very mild form of metabolic syndrome, which causes a bit more inflammation in the gut and a little bit of a leaky gut, which we do wonder, scientists have speculated that this actually enhances the transportation of microorganisms from the gut to the placenta to influence the baby, the infant there. So it's really, really interesting. But also during that pregnancy, the vaginal microbiome changes as well. And it becomes slightly less diverse. And we develop a vaginal microbiome that has an awful lot of lactobacilli in it. And so when the infant is born by a vaginal delivery, they actually pass through the vagina and pick up all these microorganisms from the vagina first. And lactobacilli are one of the first organisms that the baby gets coated in, will inhale, will ingest, and that will be one of the first organisms that actually colonize the gut microbiota of the infant. The other most important thing during the birthing process is actually the infant, if it comes as a vaginal delivery, will actually be coated in some stool and bacteria from around the back passage area as well. And that's really important because actually the majority of the infant's gut microbiota is actually determined by that exposure. So it's really important that it gets exposed to microbes from the gut of the mum at that stage, because these are the sort of normal microbes that should live in the infant's gut. So this is how they develop that. So if you're born by a vaginal delivery and you get that exposure, then you get a fairly normal looking gut microbiota with a nice diversity of gut microorganisms, which will keep the gut very, very healthy and help to develop the immune system within the gut. And we know that infants that are born by vaginal delivery actually have a much lower risk of allergies, immune disorders, and non-communicable diseases. So that's really, really important. If you compare that to infants that are born via C-section, it's a very different picture. So essentially, when you're born by C-section, you're born in an operating theatre. There's a load of there's a load of people in that operating theatre. When you're born, you come out of the skin, the baby's exposed initially to skin microorganisms from the mum. And these skin microorganisms are not natural colonizers of the gut. So when the baby's exposed to that and covered in skin microorganisms from birth attendees and various other people that are handling the baby when they're born, these are the first things that colonize the gut. But because they're not natural colonizers of the gut, and they're not the normal ones that would naturally live in there, they don't behave the same way as natural colonizers would. And so they actually are more likely to eat the mucus lining of the gut as their food source, which can cause a lot of erosion of the mucus layer and actually create inflammation within the gut. So infants born by C-section are actually more likely to have quite a dysbiotic looking gut, quite an irregular sort of ecology of microorganisms in there. And sadly, they're more likely to develop inflammatory bowel conditions and allergies, autoimmune conditions, and non-communicable disease. And obesity is much more common in infants born via C-section. So sadly, that's a bit of a major problem when it comes to C-sections, although C-sections obviously are, life-saving and so vitally important to save the life of infants and mothers if the birth is not going to plan. However, that we know that C-section rates are rising, and in my area of Scotland, we're talking sort of over 35% of infants in some hospitals in my area are being born by C-section at the moment, which is a little bit worrying. So, Siobhan, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm with you, Sheena. I was really surprised by C-section rates, and it's kind of interesting because I've been a GP for over 30 years, and it's just, not something you're so busy in your day-to-day job, you don't look at these rises over a time period. Now, I've looked into this, and the World Health Organization suggests that the optimal caesarean section rates to reduce mortality and morbidity in mother and infant is about 10 to 15%. And interestingly, when I qualified in 1989 and started practicing, that's where the UK caesarean section rates were, about 15%. Now they're double that, about 30%. In Scotland, it's a bit higher, 35. Wales, it's 28. But the global average is 21%. But it's important when we think about the global average, that spans huge differences. So you have a 5% rate in sub-Saharan Africa, which is clearly too low and of concern. And then you move over to Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's 40%. And it's not necessarily the richest countries who have the highest rates. And some of these poorer countries who still have higher rates can ill afford the increased costs associated with caesarean sections in terms of labour intense, the anaesthetists and the time it takes and the costs. The projections for 2030 are the global average is going to be nearing 30%. But again, sub-Saharan Africa moving up to only about 6% from its 5%. And the big increases are in East Asia, which is going to go to a whopping 65%. Now, as well as caesarean sections increasing, you also alter your social norms. So if you're having a normal delivery, you suddenly become a little bit unusual, which makes you think, well, maybe I should be having a caesarean section. So we've got this really odd situation where we've got underuse and overuse coexisting, and particularly in these developing countries, and it's going to really drain resources. And also we're going to move to a state where in too many caesarean sections, you're going to be increasing mortality and morbidity in the people you're trying to protect, in these mothers and babies who don't necessarily need this procedure. Now, I was talking to you, Sheena, a week ago, and you were sort of telling me about the NICE guidelines on caesarean births, because you pointed out that actually, which I hadn't realised, that they do outline the clinical indications. This is 2021 guidelines, and the clinical indications are as before, but woman's mother's choice is there. There's no mention of the gut microbiome. You'll be horrified to notice. But actually, it was interesting that the woman's choice, so quite often, if your social norm is your sister or your friend has had a caesarean section because of concerns they've had about, anxieties surrounding the birth, then you're more likely to go that way as well. They also underlined the reasons why women might choose caesarean sections. So anxiety, which I presume they mean anxiety about pain and being seen in pain, vaginal injuries, and also on the guidelines, they ask us to discuss with women urinary and fecal incontinence, which is marginally increased in vaginal delivery, but not much. But, women talking in groups and online, they'll be worried about, if someone mentions urinary and fecal incontinence and worries about their sexual health, then you can see how it's kind of the questions themselves are loading you to prefer caesarean section. So, and also I imagine the medical teams are on the back foot, the litigation, there's high profile investigations in the UK. I mean, it's been a year, I think, since the Ockenden report, which was March last year. And that was my local area, which is Shropshire, so it's Shrewsbury and Telford. And it's really traumatic to, the staff, midwives, consultants, something like that happening. And it does push people to be more, intensively, pushing towards caesarean sections because they're, all the fears about being investigated again and litigation. So the NICE as well, the guidelines just put it as, is there a higher or lower risk than for tears, vaginal tears, for example? So you can kind of see how if you were offered the choice, you might be, moving towards choosing caesarean section. Now, I suppose I want to point out this discussion is really non-judgmental. We've both got experiences of child delivery ourselves. And my experiences, quite a long time ago, but I didn't have any strong preferences for vaginal delivery or caesarean section. My husband's also a medic, and he'd done quite a lot of obs and gynae. And I have to say, because he'd done a lot of deliveries and a lot of repairs of vaginal tears, which is kind of pretty, you can get very complex tears. You can see how you can get a bias as a doctor towards the problems associated with vaginal deliveries. I was incredibly lucky because I had the same midwife for both my kids, and she was absolutely brilliant. It wasn't offered to me to have a caesarean section. There was no clinical indication. If it had been offered, I guess I might have thought, and I know my husband was sort of saying, blimey, go for a caesarean section. Why would you? He thinks it's brutal, vaginal delivery. Why would you do that? So it's kind of interesting. I don't know what your thoughts are, Sheena, with your own sort of personal experiences, but that's why I mean it's non-judgmental. But I suppose we just need to be balancing it with, these other effects on the gut microbiome, how important it is. And also, there was a meta-analysis of 21 studies with about 20,000 women, where they were looking at health-related quality of life scores after vaginal delivery or caesarean section. And there was a statistically significant improvement in physical functioning, your vitality, your social functioning after vaginal delivery versus caesarean section. That's not really, pointed out. So I don't know. It's difficult. And I would always, really be... the individual woman's choice is hugely important, but sometimes I wonder if we are making choices because if we're just following social norms. What are your thoughts, Sheena?
Yeah, and I also think that when you're having babies, you tend to be a little younger. Now, I was quite an old mum, but I have to say, even being an older mum, I wasn't particularly well researched on any of this when I did become pregnant. And I very much felt that, even as a medic, with my limited experience, and having done obs and gynae, I still didn't know very much about, the real nitty gritty of what was beneficial for me and my child in terms of delivery mode. And talking to a local gynecology friend of mine, the microbiome is not being discussed as part of this narrative. And so if that's not even part of the narrative at the moment, then, I guess people don't have any idea that there are any implications from going for C-sections that might affect the infant going forward. And I think, if people were to understand that might well influence, I know it would have influenced me way back if I'd have known anything about this. I didn't end up having C-sections, but I was just fortunate that my vaginal deliveries were relatively uncomplicated. But, there were other parts of the process that were more complicated in my situation. But I very much felt at the time that I knew very little, and actually I was in the hands of the medics around me and very much reliant on them to give me all the information that I needed. But if this isn't a talking point amongst them, and if it's not, if there's not a greater awareness there, then that does mean that people are not generally getting this information.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite an interesting point, Shiv.
I was going to say that the other thing, of course, with caesarean sections is the prophylactic antibiotics, which I know we've spoken about before. You've got this double whammy, this double insult to the neonate's gut microbiome development. So you have the lack of contact with mother's gut and vaginal microbiome. And then I think basically now everyone receives prophylactic antibiotics, and the impact of these on the developing microbiome are huge. And they're used more in prems, caesarean sections. We've got them in vaginal deliveries as well, prophylaxis for group B strep. And I know it's quite a large percentage of babies actually are receiving broad spectrum antibiotics at this time. We know these antibiotics, they reduce the diversity, the results of the antibiotics, or the impact, although your gut microbiome has a resilience factor, it can bounce back, but you're at a stage where it's actually developing, so it's difficult for it to bounce back while it's not actually, hasn't reached a steady state. And these changes are visible up to a year after antibiotics. And you certainly get reduced bifidobacterium, which is one of the sort of the star players in what's considered to be a good gut microbiome composition. So Sheena, some of us have decided to or have had to have caesarean sections. So are we doomed, or can the neonatal gut microbiome be rescued? And I suppose it's important to this is only one factor. We're covering this because it's incredibly important, but other contact and going forward, pets, siblings, relatives and nature, you'll be getting a lot more, introducing a lot more variety in bacteria. But this time does seem to be particularly important. So what are your thoughts about rescuing, Sheena?
Yeah, and rescuing's a really interesting topic at the moment. So scientists are looking a little bit more into this. And And actually, I came up as I've researched this for a few years now, just to see what's around. And people have been battering things like vaginal seeding and probiotics and things back and forth. And I came across quite an interesting article called "Infant Gut Microbiota Restoration: State of the Art." It's by Katri Korpela et al., and it's in Gut Microbes 2022. Now, interestingly, they looked at how to restore your gut microbiota post C-section birth. And what they looked at was comparing vaginal seeding with probiotics, and two different types of probiotics. So they looked at comparing probiotics that were high in bifidobacterium and proteobacterium, which are more of the organisms that you get from as gut colonizers, versus the probiotics that contain more lactobacilli, which is more what you would get from your vaginal microorganisms. And then they looked at maternal FMT. Now, FMT is a fecal microbial transfer. Now, that is when you take the stool from one person and you transfer it into another. And often that's done via an enema, or even you can even give it as in tablet forms now. And so they looked at these different methods of giving some bacteria back to the infant in those early days immediately post birth. And the interesting thing was that vaginal seeding. So vaginal seeding is where you put swabs into the vagina during the C-section birth, and then immediately after the infant's born, you use these swabs that have been inside the mother's vagina, and you coat the infant with the vaginal mucus via the swabs straight after the birth. And you coat them all over with that. So they're essentially getting a coating of lots of lactobacilli from the vagina. Now, that isn't giving them gut organisms, because they're not getting any organisms from around the perianal area or the back passage, and like they would if they were a truly born vaginal delivery. But when they looked at vaginal seeding, they found that it didn't alter the infant's gut microbiome that much. So there wasn't too dramatic a change there, and it wasn't a long-lasting change in the gut microbiota of these infants. So it wasn't hugely successful in bringing the gut microbiome of the infant in line with an infant that is born by vaginal delivery. So then they had a look at probiotics, and if they gave the infant lactobacilli-based probiotics, which is more in keeping with what they would get with a vaginal mucus exposure. Again, there wasn't a great deal of change in the infant's gut microbiota, but again, it wasn't so long lasting. However, the probiotics that contain bifidobacterium, and bifidobacterium seems to be a key player in the gut microbiome, and seems to be very, very important. It's a big producer of short chain fatty acids, so it's a very sort of anti-inflammatory microorganism for our gut, and very good at sort of keeping a very healthy gut lining and everything. So the infants that were exposed to that bacterium early on actually did have a microbiota that more resembled vaginal delivered babies, and actually it seemed to be a longer lasting probiotic as well. So even after you stop treatment with that, you still get sort of longer lasting changes within the gut microbiota. And when they looked at FMT, so actually transferring stool from the mother to the infant after birth, that infant's gut microbiota was the most dramatically changed and the most likely to resemble the vaginally delivered infant. So that seems to be the most important one in terms of, or the most effective means to deliver a sort of vaginally delivered infant's gut microbiota to a C-section baby. So that's very, very interesting. Sadly, FMT is not something that I think is widely available at the moment. So not something that would be easy to access. However, the probiotics are easy to access. You can, in fact, buy probiotics online and in health food stores and chemists. So these things are readily available. And Bifidobacterium infantilis, in particular, seems to be the one that a lot of the studies are sort of spouting as being a very beneficial microorganism to give. So that, I think, was really, really interesting. And I don't know what you think about that, Siobhan. You've not heard that paper before. What did you think?
Well, I know Korpela's work, because they're sort of do a lot of research into this area. But just going back to the Bifidobacterium infantilis, that's one of the ones that we're kind of, there's a worry. You've got to think about sort of ecological aspects of your gut microbiome. And as we use antibiotics and we're more sterile environment and have more caesarean sections, we're actually, as this inheritance, evolutionary inheritance that we're passing from one generation to another, it's considered a form of kinship that your mother's passing it down to the next generation. We're actually, each time it's passed down and it's weakened, we're actually losing various members of various bacterial species. And I think that's one of the ones that they're concerned about, this sort of heading towards extinction. So it's quite sort of interesting. The only way we may be able to get it going forward is by, using probiotics. So I suppose, one thing is, not using caesarean sections, but then you've still got the problem of how healthy are our microbiomes, as we move forward into the future. People seem to be getting more and more poorly and more dysbiotic. So what sort of microbiome are we passing on? And the second is, if the rates are going to go up anyway, then, how can we use these methods? But that seems like a very safe and, readily available and cost-effective way of doing it. So I did read another paper, actually, which I'll put in this kind of show notes. I am kind of doing this off the top of my head. It was about when you give, if you're having a caesarean section and you're given antibiotics, IV, you should give them after clamping. So kind of that makes sense, doesn't it? Otherwise, if you most of them don't really think about it. They just whack the antibiotics in, and obviously very rapidly it moves through the umbilical cord into the baby. But if you clamp and then give the antibiotics, that does make a statistical difference to the what happens. Now, there was a study where they looked at that. I'm not going to waffle on too much because I don't know all the details, but it's just quite an interesting way there are ways in which we could try and help the situation. But just to kind of step back a bit, because I always like looking at the evolutionary aspects and the kind of the bigger picture. So it's really important for us all to remember that we live in a bacterial world. They're everywhere. So they are the highest density of bacteria globally in the world are in mammalian gut, in the human gut, which is pretty astonishing. So they've been the kind of sole form of life for 2 billion years, and they've kind of been evolving all that time without us. And they're incredibly, smart little organisms. They can swim with motors. They have chemical warfare. They have these peptides they can release that can kill other bacteria. They can sense, they communicate, they remember, they form these communities called microbiomes. So they've been here for a long time. And actually, in a way, we're just another, a place for them to occupy. So it's just quite interesting if you look at it from this aspect. So if you imagine that essentially the baby, there's a bit of argument about it, but if we, for the purposes of this conversation, at birth, you are devoid of microbes mostly. So your gut represents this kind of vast, empty expanse of kind of real estate opportunity for microorganisms. And kind of, it's first person to get there gets the sort of land grab, if you like. So this acquisition of the gut microbiome, it isn't a single event. It's more of a process. So you don't just get your job lot and that's it for the rest of your life. It's really complex. And they're still trying to tease through it. But it seems that you get these ecological successive waves of different bacteria coming in, and you get this layered colonization. But the people who set the pace for it all are these first pioneers from your mother. They're very, very important. So this is kind of the Bacteroides and Bifidos. So they're kind of gifted from your mother to the newborn, and they enter the gut very quickly, and they set the rules and pave the way, create the right environment to attract the best candidates. So if you don't get these, then it's kind of, you get whatever else is around in the hospital environment. So this early colonization by these first pioneers gifted to you from your mother appear crucial to the final gut microbiome composition that your baby gets. And this composition, why is it important? Who cares? Because the composition dictates the function. So the metabolites and the structures and what happens to your immune system, not only for your baby immediately after birth, but infancy, childhood, adulthood, and lifespan, across the lifespan. So, the worry is that these modern obstetric practices have unintended consequences on this succession. So the paper I've chosen, which is it's called the Stunted, Microbiota and Opportunistic Pathogen Colonization in Caesarean Section Birth. The first author is Shao, and it's published in Nature in 2019. Now, I chose this because it's a great paper. It's got a large number of subjects, and it's published in Nature, and it's a UK study. So it looked at 600 healthy term babies born in the UK hospitals, I think it's 2014 to 2017. So it was kind of part of a sub-part of another study. So these were babies roughly split 50-50 caesarean section and vaginal delivery. And they were looking at an area that hadn't been studied much, which is the kind of what happens in the first 4 weeks. So this was kind of whole genome sequencing. So it's a very intricate and comprehensive study of the whole genome of these babies' stool. And what they found was that all babies, caesarean section or vaginal delivery, there was very rapid colonization. And they were really struck, as all these studies are, by the uniqueness. So it's almost like no two microbiomes are the same, which is pretty amazing considering a lot of the environmental conditions or whatever are similar. But Sheena, if we imagine that you are one of the babies born by vaginal delivery, so I know that your mum, if I remember rightly, when we've chatted before, she's kind of really into healthy food and grew her own fruit and veg, and I imagine was incredibly healthy and had a really good gut microbiome, which she passed on to you as a baby. So if you were one of these babies born by vaginal delivery, you would be getting a whole load of these really important pioneers, so the Bacteroides and the Bifidos. And when they measured you, you would have 68% of these important beneficial microbes in your gut, very rapidly. So and very few of the sort of pathogenic ones that we're not so keen on. So imagine that I was born by caesarean section, so as part of the study, what would my gut microbiome look like in my first month? So, astonishingly deprived of all these maternally transmitted bacteria. So really very few of the Bacteroides and Bifido, which we see as so important. And astonishingly, I have 68% of opportunistic pathogens from the healthcare environment. So that's kind of a special care baby unit or just whoever's around. Hospital environment is just packed with these kind of potentially. So when I say opportunistic pathogens, it doesn't mean that I've packed with loads of pathogens. It just means that given the right conditions, they can be pathogenic, and they also, a lot of them belong to a group that we're increasingly concerned about, where there's a high risk of antimicrobial resistance as well. So kind of any level of opportunistic pathogens is not great, particularly around this time where I'm born, I have haven't developed my own immune system. We know that the gut microbiota is incredibly important because it educates my immune system, and I haven't got that established yet. So I'm relying on passive immunity from mum, breastfeeding, which we'll talk about on another module, another podcast. But, that's really a concern about the level, 68% of these pathogens. There are things we know about that cause hospital infections, so your staph, your strep, your Klebsiella, and various Clostridium perfringens, which is another sort of big problematic one in hospital environments. So that isn't great. So let's have a look at antibiotics. Does that make a difference? Well, I can't tell you about caesarean section antibiotics because everyone has antibiotics with caesarean sections, but they did do a sort of sub-analysis of the vaginal deliveries because Most will not have had antibiotics, but some will. Those ones with group B strep will have antibiotics. And they did find that the antibiotics, again, made a really big difference, and, a less beneficial gut microbiome was noticed in those babies as well. So I suppose just to kind of wrap it up a bit, and we'll put the notes there because it's a much more interesting and complex study than I probably made it out to be. But anyway, there has been several large cohorts looking at the microbiomes of neonates, but this is kind of the longest, and it also really focuses on this very early period. And the conclusion was that the mode of delivery is the major factor in shaping the gut microbiota in the first few weeks of life. This kind of disrupted transmission with, caesarean sections and antibiotics really causes problems. You lose out on these pioneering Bacteroides species in particular, and you predispose these newborn babies to colonization by really concerning, clinically important opportunistic pathogens, which are all around the healthcare and hospital environment. The consequences, either in the short, medium or long term, have yet to be determined. But I suppose it's just this, I liked this phrase, that maternal transmission of gastrointestinal bacteria to their babies is an underappreciated form of kinship. And I kind of like that because, we don't know quite what we're doing as we move forward with increasing the number of caesarean sections. We may be living to regret it, I think.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And when you talk about the the impact that these pathogenic strains have on the microbiome development, we know that early stage of microbiome development is when the immune system develops in there. And so, that's the real concern, that if you have a very disrupted gut microbiome at that early stage in life, where the immune system of the gut is at its infancy as well, then that immune system doesn't develop as it should do. And that's why, scientists are really concerned about this. I'm very concerned about it because long term, we know that these infants have more immune disorders. We know they're more prone to autoimmune conditions, allergies, and non-communicable disease. And so, this is a really, really important area to get right. And so, sort of sleepwalking into this situation where we've got a huge number of people having C-section births and not considering the consequences is a real worry. We haven't purposefully sort of mentioned breastfeeding as a way of helping to restore the gut microbiota, because we're going to talk about breastfeeding at a later podcast. But that obviously is something to bear in mind because breast milk does contain probiotics and prebiotics, the fibers that the microbiome uses as well. So that will definitely be discussed at another podcast, and we'll go into a lot more detail there. But I think to wrap up this podcast, I think, Shiv, we need to just go through three little important nuggets of information for the listeners before we go, and then, as I say, we'll talk about other things at a later date. So, Shiv, what are your three nuggets?
Yeah, so I would say that, this vaginal delivery is a really critical time for the acquisition of this gut microbiome that your baby's going to have. And I just would say, secondly, picking up on a point you've just said, is that this gut microbiome in your baby, one of its first jobs is to educate your baby's immune system. So it's really important for the development of your baby's immune system, and whether your baby overreacts to things and then you get sort of atopy and asthma, or underreacts and then you get, concern about it not responding well to infections. So it's hugely important. And I suppose another just thought of this whole area, which I've not thought about enough, really, this whole perinatal period, and it's everyone's responsibility. And I guess it's a lifestyle medicine issue that we need to be talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. So I guess three important things that I thought of. Well, the maternal microbiome does really help to determine the health of the infant microbiome. So if you are looking after your health as a mother and you have a very healthy lifestyle, you're likely to be passing on, especially if your infant has a vaginal delivery, you're likely to be passing on a very lovely set of microorganisms to them, which will help them to establish a lovely, healthy microbiome right from the start. However, if you're not looking after your health, if you are suffering from obesity, chronic disease, you're on lots of medications, you're not getting enough sleep, you're under a lot of stress, you're not exercising, all of these things will have an impact on your gut microbiome, and that's the one you're going to give to your infant. So it's a really important thing for mothers to be aware of. The other points I wanted to make is about probiotics. So probiotics are available and probably underused, especially for infants from C-section births. They have been quite thoroughly investigated because they're used in premature infants. And so there are lots of interesting studies showing that probiotics given to neonates are actually incredibly safe. And even if the neonate were to develop a sort of probiotic-induced infection, they're very readily, easily treatable. But actually, that's an incredibly rare event. So even in these very vulnerable infants born very, very early on, they appear to tolerate probiotics very, very well. So I think perhaps that's an area that people should be looking into a little bit more as incorporating into protocols for people post C-section. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that breast milk is one very good source of probiotics, but we will be covering that at a later date. So I think that's all for today. Thank you very much for listening to today's podcast, and we'll speak to you soon again. Thank you so much. That's goodbye from the Microbiome Medics.